hard to not believe that money has a lot to do with this, okay?
Well, this is an eye-opener. Another thing for me to worry about now.
The mainstream media gives you the impression that there is nothing good about America. In direct contrast to that, my podcasts will prove by examples that America has always been and still is the land of opportunity for everyone.
Welcome to another episode in the series Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to remind you that if you have any questions for me, you can go to my website and click on either the Questions tab in the middle of the home screen or on Ask a Question tab that is on the right side of every screen. I'll answer your questions at the beginning of each episode. Now on with the show. My guest today is Dr. Aaron Goodman. Dr. Goodman joined the medical staff of the University of San Diego in 2017, and in just 5 years was promoted to Associate Professor of Medicine. He is board certified in not just one specialty, and not two, but 3 specialties: internal medicine, medical oncology, and hematology. He is both a practitioner and a researcher. In addition to teaching medical students and caring for patients at the Moores Cancer Center, he carries out groundbreaking cancer research. Over the past few years, he has published 77 technical papers in prestigious medical publications. And with all of that, he still finds time for playing guitar in a rock band. I understand it's every Saturday night, someplace near La Jolla. And of course, spending quality time with his wife and 3 young kids. He's a very impressive and very busy guy. On a personal note, I first met Dr. Goodman 6 years ago when he was a research fellow at the Moores Cancer Center, where I was a patient. I was diagnosed with T-cell lymphoblastic lymphoma, a rather rare form of blood cancer that in older patients is considered to be incurable. Dr. Goodman and his mentor, Dr. Edward Ball, had the courage to prescribe a difficult course of chemotherapy called hyper-CVAD that cures the cancer, but very often ends up killing older patients. As you can see, it did kill the cancer, but it didn't kill me. Today, we're going to talk about the state of medicine in our country, how drugs are approved, and ways to improve both. Dr. Goodman, welcome to the show.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Bob. It's an honor. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. And there was a nice, lengthy and nice introduction. But I think, a lot of fancy words for, I'm a blood doctor. I take care of patients who have cancers of the blood. And the blood is more than just red blood cells. It's actually your immune system. And just like breast cells can become breast cancer, immune cells can become cancer. And there's hundreds of different leukemias, lymphomas. And it's truly a privilege to take care of patients such as yourself and others with these really are life-threatening illnesses that are curable in many with appropriate and timely therapy. So thanks for having me. I look forward to a great discussion.
Sure. Now, I don't want to discuss COVID or the vaccines that have been widely made available. But given the recent reports of serious side effects that have been attributed to the COVID vaccine, I'd like to understand how new drugs are discovered, tested, and then approved for use by the FDA. So first, how are new drugs discovered? Who discovers them, and why do they choose to discover that drug?
Yes, so it's a complicated question that I'm going to try to break down, and I'm going to focus this. So there's drug discovery for all fields, for cardiovascular medicine, pulmonary medicine, but we're going to focus particularly on oncology. So drugs that are being developed to treat patients with cancer. So the first step is really what's called preclinical development. When I say preclinical, that means before a human ever is exposed to the drug. And usually there's some sort of a pathway in the cell, a molecular pathway, or some sort of strong preclinical rationale of why a compound may be active in a particular cancer. So to break it down, let's pretend you have a cell that has, so all of your body's made of cells, right? And these are little bricks that build all the organs in your body, and your blood is also cells. And each cell has, and we've heard of DNA, right? Think Jurassic Park. So DNA is it's the instructions for the cell. And I always tell my patients, think of it as computer code, and with time, what happens to computer code? Sometimes things get a little screwy with the computer. It doesn't work great. And this same process can happen in the DNA of your cells, and we call that mutations, okay? And these aren't mutations that you are born with. So although this is a genetic disease, cancer is a disease what we call acquired mutations. So it happens as we age. It's actually a natural process. And usually these mutations, the cells are smart. They either die because they don't work great, or there's actually repair processes that fix these mutations.
Or I imagine your immune system goes after some of those.
And we'll get into the immune system. Or the immune system goes, this cell's kind of crappy. It's not behaving. I'm going to kill it. But because we have trillions of cells and even more DNA, just by pure probability, these mistakes can get missed. Okay, the body's not perfect. And over time, these cells can get multiple mutations, and then you can develop a cancer. So a cancer, it's your own cells with lots of different mutations, and then the cell starts to misbehave. Either it grows too fast or it spreads, and that's how patients get sick with cancer. So getting back to drug discovery, usually there's some process, so there's a mutation in the DNA that activates some pathway in the cell. For example, cells naturally will divide, and there's breaks on cell division because you don't want these cells to divide too fast. Well, you can get mutations in those breaks. So now the cell just divides and forgets how to break. Okay, and those are called activating or oncogenes that get mutated and stimulate the cell. So we can develop drugs, let's take compound A, that maybe inhibits that cell growth pathway, okay? So now we have a cancer where we've developed a compound and we think it's gonna inhibit this pathway, so there's a strong preclinical rationale, at least in our brains, it makes sense that this may be active, okay? But as we'll learn, just because something makes sense in our brains or preclinically, it doesn't always make patients feel better or live longer, which is our ultimate goal. So the first thing we do is we then test these in basically test tubes, whether they're cell cultures.
So you are doing that. It's not drug companies.
So this is all, or the drug company or academia, scientific labs. And we're not getting into the nitty gritty of that. But they do enough of these tests where they prove to a regulatory agency, the FDA, that we have a strong rationale and an appropriate dose to start testing this in humans, okay?
And before that, is it tested in animals or not?
Yeah, so they'll usually do animal models, mice, sometimes rats, sometimes even non-human primates like monkeys. And this is, again, all the preclinical. And they develop enough of a rationale and safety profile in these preclinical tests that they present this to the FDA and they say, we now want to start testing this in humans, okay? So the first testing in humans are what's called phase 1 clinical trials. And we're going to talk a lot about the different phases of clinical trials. And in these clinical trials, you take your compound, and the goal of the clinical trial is not to even determine if it's active.
Just see if it's safe.
It's safe.
I see.
And determine what we call the maximal tolerated dose. Okay, you start a phase 1. When you're enrolling that first patient, everyone's kind of nervous, right? Because you're given a compound that's never been given to a human before. And so you start at a baby dose. Actually, if you're usually the first person enrolled on these studies, you're getting almost certainly a dose that won't do anything. And then they have these designs where they slowly titrate up till they see what are called dose-limiting side effects. When enough people get sick or a bad side effect from the drug, they then say, we've reached our maximal tolerated dose, and they have pre-specified criteria for this.
And this isn't a control group. These are people who actually have the cancer that you're trying to.
So in cancer studies, I just described this. Who on earth would sign up for this? Well, if you're an unfortunate patient who has seen all of our standard therapies, maybe even been on later stage clinical trials, and nothing works, you're at the point now where the benefits outweigh the risks. And as you know from personal experience, oncology and medicine in general is, my job is to determine in every given patient if the benefit outweighs the risk. If you had to summarize what I do, and it can get quite complex, but that's what doctors do. We just analyze benefit and risk, and if the benefit's better than the risk, we say, you should probably do this, okay? But getting back to the phase 1 clinical studies, so these patients, their risk is soon death from their cancer, unfortunately. And so it makes sense for them to participate in a clinical trial, which I do encourage. And they are also, I think, patients, I can't say this personally, I've never been part of a clinical trial, but I think some patients take pride in knowing that, they're trying to help their fellow human, which is what we want us to succeed as a species and have better treatments. So patients do enroll in these studies. And so they find the maximal tolerated dose. And this is at point, now this is done at cancer centers or universities. And I got a little bit ahead of myself, but these studies are usually sponsored by the pharmaceutical who has the compound. So say, I'm not going to name a specific pharmaceutical, but a big pharmaceutical owns this compound. They are designing the study, but they are using the university and the cancer center and physicians such as myself to run the study.
And who came up with the idea for that compound? It might have been a researcher at a university or in the drug company.
It could be either or, and if it's a researcher, they may have sold the compound to the pharmaceutical.
Okay, got it.
Okay, and these are what are called industry-sponsored studies. Okay, there are some studies that are completely done by us and academics where there's no collusion with pharmaceutical. We'll get into that later when I'm done explaining the different...
And the funding for that comes from the government?
Yes,
or from
the government grants, NIH, or from donors, philanthropy, those types of things. And those are not so much as influenced by pharmaceuticals, although they still kind of are, and we'll talk about that in a second. So once we get the maximal tolerated dose, so a lot of drugs, they are too dangerous and just they stop it there. You know, the drug company or the investigators who are studying the compound be like, this isn't going to work. You know, these hundreds of millions of dollars going to development, and you know, every stage that the company invests in is more money being put into the drug, and roughly the amount of compounds that enter phase 1, about 1 in 20, if not even that, will actually end up being FDA approved. Okay, so after the phase 1, you then enter what's called a phase 2 study. And the phase 2 study is also a single-arm study where they're not comparing it to a group, but they're now taking a larger group of patients and they're taking that maximally tolerated dose and they're now looking for efficacy. Okay, actually they're looking for activity, and those words are not the same. And let me just define that while we're here. I want to make sure, you know, sometimes we can get carried away as scientists and like you don't know what the hell we're talking about. And I want everyone to be clear on this. So activity is a cancer drug shrinks a tumor, okay? Meaning it gets smaller. That's a good thing, but not necessarily
doesn't
beneficial.
necessarily extend life.
You're right, it doesn't. You're already ahead of the game, most people. And most doctors don't even realize that. Efficacy is making a patient live longer or feel better.
Right.
That's an efficacious drug. Phase 2 studies are looking at activity. So they'll typically look at what's called a response rate. So what's a response rate? Well, you got cancer. Say you got tumors throughout your body. You take a drug, and it shrinks by some percent, okay? And some it's 30, some 50, okay? Now, when that tumor shrinks below 50%, does the patient all of a sudden go, man, I'm feeling great? Like they were feeling crappy at 40%? No, this is just these cutoffs that we have, and we would call that a response. And so phase 2 studies will look for a certain amount of patients that achieve that response, okay? Maybe they'll say if the compound has a 30 to 40% response rate in this highly relapsed refractory patient population, it's worth taking to phase 3. The other thing that they'll look at, which is again not another endpoint that patients feel, it's one that we've designed. It's called progression-free survival. And that is say you have a response, you give it to a bunch of patients, it's how long they respond until it starts growing again, okay? There's a few other definitions for that, but that's the ballpark, okay? Once they've shown that say they give this compound to a bunch of people and no one responds, they're not going to continue because in general, actually in almost all cases, drugs that end up making us live longer and feel better at least shrink tumors. I think we can all agree that if a drug can't even shrink a tumor, it's going to be pretty hard to believe that it's going to make someone live longer or feel better. Right. Although we'll get to it. Some drugs have been approved that don't even shrink tumors.
But it may stop the spread, I suppose. Right? If it stops the spread, that would be
a
good
if
thing.
It stops the spread. But again, like it would be very unusual to have a compound just freeze the cancer in time and do nothing else. Okay. That would be an unusual situation. But once it achieves this phase 2, and it's got a response and enough for the company or the investigators to feel this is worth now challenging in a phase 3. Okay. And a phase 3 is the final phase, and these are randomized clinical trials, meaning there is a control group. Okay. And so one arm,
which has the disease.
Yeah. So everyone has the given cancer you're studying. Right. Okay. And the control group should get, and we'll get into some of the things the drug companies do, what you would do if the patient were sitting in front of you if they weren't on trial, right? They should get what the standard is. If they are not getting the standard, then the trial has already introduced a bias to it. Right.
Well, but the other group that is getting the actual drug isn't getting the standard treatment either.
But they're consented and appropriately informed, and there's reason to believe that what they're getting is going to be better,
right,
or safer.
But the control group is not getting the test drug, so it's not going to make him better, and he's not getting the normal treatment.
Well, in some situations, we'll go over that.
I
So in a
see.
good randomized clinical study, the control group better be getting what I would do in my practice.
I see.
I always, what I tell the fellows, if I have a patient in front of me that I'm consenting for a randomized clinical trial, the first thing I look at is, well, what do 50% of the patients get if they get in the control group?
Right.
And before I look at that, I tell the fellow, or I write down on a piece of paper what I would be recommending my patient. And then I go look at the protocol. And if that is not in the control group,
see.
I take the protocol and rip it in half, because that is a BS,
Right.
unethical study. And you'd say, Dr. Goodman, there's got to be enough safeguards in place to prevent that from ever getting there. And unfortunately, that is not the case. Okay?
I see.
And
so basically, they stop all treatment in that control group.
well, no, they would get some treatment that I would call substandard.
I see.
So say they'll get some treatment that we already know is inferior to some other treatment.
Right. I see.
Okay.
I see.
So the goal of the phase 3 is to, in an ideal world, is to show that the intervention, the experimental arm,
Works better than nothing.
and it works better than what the standard is,
Okay.
what they would be getting. Okay, in some cases it is nothing because it's in a population where there is no standard.
Okay.
but in most situations it's where we have an established standard.
I see.
The other thing is, when I say better, it has to be something that matters to patients. Okay, and what matters to patients? You are a patient. What are the two things that matter to you when you
How
are
you feel
taking
and if you're going to live longer.
exactly?
That's it.
And if it
That's
doesn't do one of those two things,
Right.
then who cares?
Right.
Okay. Unfortunately,
So that's never measured.
well, it's measured in some, but not all trials. Actually, most trials now that are run for phase 3 regulatory approval for the FDA are not using an endpoint that matters, overall survival
No
or feeling better. They
kidding.
use surrogate endpoints, which are either response rate or progression-free survival, which we think makes people live longer, but a lot of the times it is not. Okay, so I think now we have a framework, right, of how drugs are.
I didn't understand progression-free survival.
Yeah. So you take a drug and say it's active, okay?
Right.
And
It's
you
stop-
go into
it's
either you go
shrinking
into
them.
remission or it shrinks.
Right.
It's the amount of time until the tumor starts growing again.
I see. Can't you give more of the drug? Oh, you've been giving
You're
the
on
drug
the
all
drug.
that time. You're
And then
on the
now
drug.
you're on the drug and it's growing again.
It's still growing
So
again.
now you've been the
Oh,
other
progression-free. So it doesn't. How long does it keep it under control?
yes,
I see.
or the patient dies. That would be considered an event.
I see.
Okay. Which again intuitively makes sense. Like, yeah, that's a good, but it's the longer it stays down, that should matter. But as has been shown in numerous times, when progression-free survival is active for a drug, we then later go on to show the drug doesn't prolong survival, and sometimes it actually decreases survival. So, does the framework make sense right now? I'm hoping the
Yes,
audience.
but I'm just curious if the tumors are shrunk and they stay shrunk, why would you die?
Okay, this is a great question. So, let's go into now how the pharmaceutical industry can rig this process.
Measures this,
I'm going
right.
to use these words because, again, before I get into this discussion, I have taken, they go, Dr. Goodman, you're so critical. We have done, physicians, investigators, and the pharmaceutical industry have done lots of great for patients, and I'm not taking that away. We are curing more patients than ever. Our patients are doing better. But we still do a lot wrong, and there's nothing wrong with trying to further improve.
Make it better.
Yeah. So, I will be pointing out the fallacies or what I think's wrong in our field, but I still completely acknowledge all the good we have done. Okay. So, pharmaceuticals, we're in a capitalist society, and I get it. The pharmaceuticals' goal is what?
Making money.
They want to sell.
Return on
they want
investment.
they want to make money. So how can they make money? Sell more drug.
At
How
a
do you
higher
sell more
price.
drug? You make your patient population bigger. So basically, if you have a drug, so one way they do that is say you have a drug approved in the relapse space. Well, not everyone makes it. We want to move it to the front line space. That's more. So that's a way they can do it. They can raise the price of their drug. And I think we know that pharmaceuticals are fairly expensive these days. Okay. They can make the drug be given longer. They can say, we're not going to study this for a few months. Let's do this thing called maintenance where you stay on it forever. Okay. And those are really the main ways the pharmaceuticals can make more money. So they're going to do everything in their power when they are designing the studies to make sure those things happen. And I'm not mad. It's not their fault. They're doing what they need to do. Okay. But I do think it's our fault as investigators. These industry-sponsored studies, Yeah, they're designed by pharma, but guess what? If a doctor like me doesn't approve it and enroll patients, they can't do anything without us. We actually have complete control over the problem. No one can be enrolled without an investigator such as myself enrolling the patient. So let's go into some ways that the pharmaceuticals can take advantage of the system. Okay?
But they could hire doctors on their own payroll and have them run the trials, or that's not allowed?
They can't do that because they need to be, these studies are run in academic centers.
I see.
So they can't, they completely rely on us.
An academic.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily be academic, private practice too, but they rely on a clinician.
Yes.
Someone has to approve their protocol and say, this is appropriate for my patients. Okay?
It's good, yeah. And I'll watch it.
IRB, all these things. So, and I didn't go into that. All these clinical studies, once they're designed, they then have to go through a whole regulatory process through the FDA, the Institutional Review Board of the given university, to make sure that it's fair. Although we have these measures in place, and you'll see that we fail because I think unfair studies make it to our patients all the time. So let's start with the easiest examples of how they rig the system. So they have this drug, and they're looking for regulatory approval, so they need to show that it's better than something else. Well, to their advantage to make that something else not that good. They don't want to compare it to a Rolls Royce. They want to come. And I'm not a car dude, so they want to compare it to a not so great. The Toyota that I drive. They don't want to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in a huge randomized phase 3 study across the globe where they have a chance of losing.
Right.
So they'll take, what they'll do is they'll pick a control arm that's weak. Okay. And there's a few ways they do that. I mean, and when I say weak, where they already know we already have another study that's been published that shows that the control arm is worse than something else. So how do they do that? Well, they'll do it two ways. Well, they do it one main way, actually. They'll run the majority of the study in countries that don't have access to the care that we have in the United States.
And that is the middle of the road drug here is the best one you can get in Peru.
So they'll run it in like India or in Asia or even parts of Europe where they don't have access to these drugs. And some would say, well, that's good. They're getting access to these drugs, but is it? The company is seeking the money in pharma is the USA. Sure. We have the bankroll. They don't make their money off those other countries. They make it off us.
They can't afford it.
So they're seeking
so they're going to use that data.
Exactly. They're seeking regulatory approval in the United States. So if you're seeking regulatory approval in the United States, you better run the freaking study in the United States using a control arm that we would use. Right. Okay. And they don't do that. They'll run the majority, and they'll actually have a few centers in the United States that might not even enroll any patient because they know. So I've gotten into fights with colleagues, and I'll be like, "You're the principal. So why would an investigator open such a study in the United States?" Well, here's where pharma's smart. They know what do academic doctors need? What's our currency in academics?
Grants
and publications.
Right.
Publications is the money. Our promotions are based off these publications. Our fame in the field is based off these publications. So these randomized clinical studies that lead to regulatory approval are big studies published in big journals. So if I'm a doctor,
you want to run those studies.
I want to run these studies, and I'd be like, well, this control kind of stinks, but I maybe won't enroll anyone, or I'll enroll very select.
And you have no influence over the control.
No, that's what's designed by the thing. Well, you could not open the study. But
but they come to you with take it or leave it.
They come to you and they say, you sometimes can say, I'm not doing because this, but usually what happens is they'll be like, screw you, we'll find someone else. And they can easily find someone else.
Right.
And so the investigator does it, even though it's the control arm, half the patients isn't what they would give their own mother if they had the cancer that they were treating. And the trial will be positive. They'll get invited to our big conventions. They'll give the big talk, the ovations, pop the champagne, drug gets approved. And they get a huge publication, looks good for them, and then the cycle feeds itself.
But what the study shows, it's better than that drug. But that doesn't mean...
It's better than shit I don't use.
Right, that's right.
So it doesn't inform my care.
So it shouldn't... So they can do that, and it's on the shelf at the pharmacy, but that doesn't mean doctors are going to prescribe it.
Well, that's...
right?
Or the FDA should approve it. But the FDA... getting into the FDA, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Growing up, I would be like, I trust the FDA. I trust our government to make policy decisions, and I would hope that the regulatory board that approves drugs are approving drugs that are safe and effective for our patients. But I won't list them all. There are numerous examples where the scenario I just described, where a drug is approved off a crappy control arm,
and it's
FDA
better than the
approves
control arm.
Now it's an option, makes it into our guidelines, and the arguments will be, well, more options are better for our patients. Leave it up to the doctor to figure it out. But I'm like,
No,
these
you're too busy.
pharmaceuticals that got $1 gazillion, they need to run a study that tells me how to best use it so I can help my patient. And the FDA approves these. And so it's quite I think when I explain it to most people, they're like, how is that possible? And they're kind of disgusted. That's my reaction. But it happens, and we have numerous approvals. With my group did a study where we looked at one cancer, we looked at multiple myeloma. We found that 1 in 5 randomized studies that were sponsored by pharmaceuticals in multiple myeloma, the control arm at the time of enrollment or during enrollment was proven inferior, was proven to be substandard care. So this is
inferior not to the new drug, but inferior to whatever
else.
Was available.
Meaning if the patient weren't on trial,
right,
they would get better than the control
I
arm.
get it.
That's not fair.
I get it. Ooh.
That's not fair. And we could be harming patients by enrolling.
You're
with
withholding a more efficacious drug.
So, so that's one way pharmaceuticals can game it. Another way is they can. So there's this process called. Any questions though on that last?
No, yeah. Still, all right. So it passes all these things, and I understand how it can be biased, but there's no requirement to test whether or not it extended life or extended the number of happy days.
Yeah. So not only are these trials compared to something that I wouldn't use in my practice,
right,
a substandard, unethical control arm, what they're measuring is a bullshit endpoint.
Right.
So at the very least, if they were going to compare it to something crappy, at least show that they make the patient live longer, feel better. But they don't. They'll actually use endpoints like progression-free survival or arbitrary endpoints like response rate, meaning, yes, the
Shrinkage.
patients, their tumor shrinks a little bit more, but that doesn't equate to patients feeling better or live longer. And you go, well, that doesn't intuitively make sense. If the tumor's shrinking, patients should live longer. And I'll tell you how that's not the case. And I'll give you examples. Whenever you give a cancer drug, okay, you have to balance the risk of toxicity to the benefit of shrinking the tumor, okay? And you can imagine if something's really good at shrinking tumors but kills a bunch of patients, you might actually show that the survival with the drug, even though the response rate's better, the survival's lower.
Right.
Okay. And
because the drug killed the patient.
Because the drug, yeah.
Right.
I mean,
the patient doesn't
patients
care.
in remission, but they're dead, or the toxicity signal is so long, those matter, okay? And there are recent examples, 2 drugs in multiple myeloma, another blood cancer. They were approved under accelerated approval in a phase 2 study. Basically, they showed they had good response rates in a patient population with limited options. Okay, they then ran the confirmatory phase 3 study. The drug's already approved to get it to market, and lo and behold, showed that both drugs were actually killing people more. Or the one example's particularly horrible is, and I'm going to name the drug because this was just awful, the drug called belantamab mafodotin, okay? It's an antibody to that's linked to a chemo, so it's like a missile linked to chemo that's specific to a target on the multiple myeloma cell, okay? And this drug had a response rate of 30% in a difficult to treat population.
30% means it shrank tumors?
Yeah.
30% of their size, or 30% of the time it shrank?
That 30% of patients with myeloma who got the drug on their initial study, the tumor got smaller.
Okay, 30%.
And with myeloma, we measure, I'm not going to go into the details. Just trust me, it got better.
Yeah.
And so they then, the problem with that drug is it has a 70% risk of eye toxicity. Now, there's different, diarrhea stinks, a little rash stinks, but going blind or what we call keratitis, that's pretty scary.
70%.
70% would get any grade decreased vision. 30%, equal to the response rate, would actually get so bad they'd have to stop the drug and could lose vision. Okay? And so that doesn't, if I'm going to prescribe such a drug, I better know it's making my patients live longer. It's clearly not making them feel better.
You may not want to live longer if you're blind.
Exactly. Or at least improving their quality of life, preventing fractures from their cancer, doing something. Well, they ended up running the confirmatory study already after the drug had been approved for over a year. Millions of dollars made. They had key opinion leaders in my field marketing this drug everywhere, saying this is the new thing. Of course, this study is going to be positive. It's this immunotherapy. The study was negative. And not only that, they compared it to it didn't even beat the crappy control arm they used in the study. So the drug's actually been withdrawn from the market. But it never should have made the market. And actually,
if it didn't even surpass the control, then why did the FDA give it approval?
Because the FDA has, and I don't know. So that's why I think that there must be some love between the pharmaceuticals and the FDA. Because the drug was approved based off just a response rate, and the feeling was this is an at-need population, and it would be harmful to withhold. But my argument always is, well, maybe you're harming them by, which they were in this particular scenario.
Giving it.
And these drug companies have lots of money. They have the means to run the appropriate study, make them run the study. It will only delay approval. Not by that long. They've studied this by looking at a study with an appropriate endpoint. It may delay approval by 6 to 9 months. Yeah, I mean, that's not, but to show that you're actually helping patients, I think it's worth it. And it's not like patients with myeloma have no other options. There were quite a few other options available to that population. So, this particular drug harming patients, it'd be one thing if the pharmaceutical didn't charge a lot. So clearly this is a drug with, well, in this case, didn't even help patients, charging $25,000 a month for this bad boy. And which leads me to my next point. There are, certain drugs that are approved that maybe were ran against an appropriate control arm, but the endpoint was progression-free survival. So maybe they showed that by taking this drug compared to what you would have gotten, your cancer stays in remission a few months, maybe 2 to 3 months longer, and has not improved your survival. Meaning, you take this drug, die. You tell the patient, you take this drug, it has not been shown to make you live longer. It definitely won't make you feel better. It's going to shrink the
tumor, but you're not going to live longer.
Yeah, you may have the tumor a little smaller for 2 months.
Yeah.
Should that be approved? I'm not one
especially at that price.
Yeah, and this is a majority of approvals now. Should this be approved? I get it. Some people want to try everything, and that I think But if you're going to approve a drug that is pretty marginal, wouldn't you call that a marginal drug? That's no game changer. You're a businessman. If you're going to charge a lot of money for something, it better be damn good.
Right.
The efficacy or the activity of a drug and the price are completely discordant in our current system of pharmaceuticals, meaning these drugs that I just described will still cost $30,000, $50,000 a month, while we have some drugs that do make people live longer or even cure patients, like chemotherapy, that are pennies on the dollar.
Wow.
So there's a complete disconnect between.
Well, I don't understand why there's no measure of extending life or increasing happiness during the remaining time.
We as investigators don't make them do that.
Yeah.
And the FDA also
But nobody measures that. Nobody asks.
They do.
It's so easy to measure when people die. I mean, how they feel. Do you feel good? You feel bad? That's a different story. That's more subjective. But measuring extension of life from what is normal without this drug is easy to do. And that's something I would ask of if I was in that condition, I'd say, how long will it extend my life? Right?
I completely agree. And, so why does pharmaceuticals not want to do it? Because let's be honest, it's hard to develop drugs that make us live longer. No, it is. It's hard to do that. So they're less likely to win. It's easier to show improvements in these meaningless benefits. And I will say some of the arguments from the other side is, well, Dr. Goodman, in some of our cancers, patients live a very long time. And to show an improvement in overall survival would take a long time or a very large study. But some of my colleagues, Dr. Prasad has discovered this, has studied this, where they looked at the time to show overall survival from progression-free survival. On average, is only, I think it was 3 to 6 months. It wasn't some monumental thing. So I think, and who pushes that agenda? The pharmaceuticals do it. How do they push that agenda? They run conferences that they fund. They get the speakers they want to speak to teach all these things. And when I was brought up as an oncologist, I was drinking the Kool-Aid too. It wasn't until I actually had to do some independent thought and met people like Dr. Prasad, Dr. Booth, who really, made me think differently. What seems like, it's funny, when I say these principles to clinical trial doctors, they'll be like, Dr. Goodman, you're crazy. But then I teach it to a first-year medical student, they'll be like, you make sense. Why are we somehow corrupt us in the process of our training. And it's completely unfortunate. And I will say that the vast majority of drugs right now that are approved have not been shown to make us live longer or live better, cost an astronomical amount of money, and are serving to really only benefit the pharmaceuticals and possibly the investigators who are opening these studies, and not our patients.
Well, it increases the number of papers, and that's why when you're speaking to a younger doctor or a medical student, they have nothing to lose by thinking logically and agreeing with you. Whereas the professionals who are writing papers, they have something to lose, because if suddenly the drug companies were forced to do it the way that we're currently talking about, there'd be fewer papers written, less money.
Yeah, and also, if you start speaking out on these issues, like I have done, guess what? Do the clinical trial companies come to me to run their studies anymore?
No, because they know
do not. I don't care.
Right.
I'm doing research in other things, but they don't. And do you get invited to speak at the big conferences? No. Do I piss off a lot of people in my field? Yes. Have I even had pharmaceuticals reach out to my supervisors? Actually, yes. Have I gotten threatening emails? Yes. Do I see lies about me online? Yes. Like, I've been accused of insider trading and purposely talking down certain drugs. It's actually, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but like, it's kind of scary, actually. These things happen. They have huge power and control over a lot of things. And, as Dr. Prasad again, and I bring his name up a lot, he's taught me a lot of this, so I don't want to take credit. Look where FDA officials go when they're done. They go right into pharma. Okay, it's a revolving door. FDA, you finish and you take some high consulting job in pharmaceuticals, right. and
everybody knows that, and that's why they're agreeing with what other pharma says.
It's hard to not believe that money has a lot to do with this. Okay.
Well, this is an eye opener. Another thing for me to worry about now.
Well, my hope would be that physicians would. It's hard for oncologists. It's hard for physicians. There is so much data all the time. We don't have time to read every primary study, think through these things. And so we rely on magazines, journals, conferences to inform us of a lot of this stuff. But guess what? If the people giving that information are funded by pharma, which it all is, the journals get money from pharma, the conferences get money from pharma, the agenda is going to be skewed.
And FDA gets money from pharma, doesn't it? I read that a fair amount of the budget, I forget what the percent was, comes from pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, I don't know the exact number, so I don't want to comment on that. But yeah,
there is money flowing into the FDA.
And there's lots of money, okay? And who's losing? It's really the patients. I mean, there are patients go broke affording these drugs, and these are drugs that are, again, they're not benign. It's not like taking a vitamin pill. These are drugs with potentially life-threatening complications, okay? And it makes it harder because guess what? Say a patient comes to me and they don't got many options, and they go, Dr. Goodman, I've heard about drug so-and-so. Will you prescribe it? It's approved by the FDA. The guidelines say it's an okay choice, and then I try to explain to them why I'm not doing it. Right. Listen, I get it. It looks like I'm withholding care from them. But what I try to do is be like, for all I know, I will shorten your life by giving you this drug. And usually, but you can definitely see from a patient standpoint, it gets even sicker, actually. There's patient advocacy groups, okay? And these are groups of patients that advocate for their given cancer. And they invite speakers. They have huge presence on Twitter, all over the thing. Guess who subsidizes these patient advocacy groups? Pharma's not stupid. All their money comes from pharmaceuticals. It does, a lot of their money. So these, we need organizations that govern our field in medicine that are truly withdrawn from that industry.
They're unbiased.
Unbiased, and once you start getting the pharmaceuticals involved, I'm not blaming them. They're doing they're good. They're good business people. They know what works. They wouldn't be giving thousands of dollars to physicians and funding all these things if they were throwing out their money. They've studied this. They know it fulfills their end goal. They wouldn't do it. They spend gazillions of dollars researching all this stuff, knowing exactly how to do it, or they wouldn't do it. So it's really up to us to be the gatekeepers for this. And again, my voice and a few of my colleagues that have inspired me, I feel like right now we are in the minority, but I am very hopeful through direct education, social media, new organizations, that we can start changing the narrative. And I'm not saying to completely change it, but to at least have our voice at the table to when it comes to discussing some of these things.
No, I would think that there could be a rule or a law that the FDA says when you're testing a new drug, the control has to be the best available in the U.S. For that disease. That's the control. And if it's not better than the best available, then we're not going to approve it.
I completely agree. Or it should be at least the institutional review board at a university should be like, how is this ethical? Your control arm's getting crappy treatment.
No, it should be the control
arm. These IRBs, I'm saying it's just administrative bureaucracy. They don't do shit. If they did it, these studies would not be approved. They go through it and they get the check that they went through the IRB, and all these things, these mechanisms we have placed to prevent this, they happen. So, and again, this isn't all the time. A lot of our studies are good, but it's enough of the time that it's a problem.
No, I completely understand what you're saying. I'm going to take fewer drugs from now on.
I think, if you have a good relationship with your doctor, and you have,
right. But the doctors don't have time. They'll look at the studies and they're not going to look at what the control was necessarily.
You're right.
Right?
We don't have
They'll
time.
say, it was much better. And you read the abstract, and I've read technical papers. You read the abstract and say, okay, it looks good. 60% tumor reduction over the control. You don't know the control was crap.
And guess what? Guess who's writing those papers? Although our names are on it, it's usually a medical writer paid for by the industry, sponsored by the industry. Usually the authors are receiving money from that given. These are all things that should easily fixable. You just shouldn't allow it. And they're published in our biggest journals, New England Journal of Medicine. I'm an academic. Like, if I paid someone to write my paper for me, that should be considered plagiarism.
That's right. It's plagiarism.
Not in oncology. Right. Get the medical writer to write it for you.
Medical
writer writes it. Paid for by.
You give them the data.
Basically, no. Let's look so the pharmaceutical designs the study.
Right.
Okay. The investigator enrolls the patients and consents. Right. The data is collected. The analysis of the data is done by the pharmaceutical. The writing of the paper, and then they send it all back to investigators. I've been on these studies, and they ask for your approval.
And then they put your name on it.
Yep. So, it's an easy way to get publications. And these investigators this is where I'm going to get hate. This is not everything. These investigators do a lot of good work. But let's all be honest, a lot of this bad stuff's happening. And we need to be vocal about it so we stop.
Now, we've all seen ads on TV about new prescription drugs. In those ads, the patients are always cheery. They're playing golf, they're playing tennis, or they're with their families celebrating a birthday. And in the background, so you see all that activity. And in the background, the announcer is saying very quickly in a quiet voice that this medicine has the following side effects, and many of them, and they tell you, can lead to death.
Yeah.
All right? Now, they're influencing the patients, right? Now, this is not an over-the-counter drug, and I can understand you're influencing people, but they influence the patient to ask the doctor for that drug, because I've seen it on TV, and it worked for those people. Yeah. Now, I would think that's unethical to advertise to the patients who have no ability to buy the drug. See, I think that's an abuse of advertising.
I think direct advertising from industry to patients should just be, they shouldn't allow it. Like, they don't allow cigarette ads anymore.
Right.
You're right, because then they come to you and, they're like, you don't know about this, or like, why aren't you giving me this? And again, what I think patients can, if a patient's listening, what can they take home? If you're, at least in the field of oncology, if your doctor is prescribing a given drug, just ask them 2 simple questions that they should know. Has this been shown in a well-designed study to make me live longer or feel better? And how do we feel better? We have great scoring systems where we look at quality of life metrics, and you can do that. And if the doctor doesn't know, he should be able to look it up. And if he can't find it, then maybe think hard about not getting on that drug.
Or changing doctors.
And again, like, I do this, and sometimes I don't even know, and I've made it a practice, and sometimes I do use these drugs that haven't been shown to do that. It's patient, it's all a given circumstance. Let me give 2 profound examples of that are opposites. So let's say I have a patient with metastatic pancreatic cancer, and that's a bad diagnosis. We have very few drugs that are active, and all patients with metastatic pancreatic cancer will die of some point from their disease. And they're still fit and are candidate for therapy. I, as a treating physician, the level of evidence that I require for that situation is not going to actually be super high, because what we have to lose is not much.
Right.
Okay. Now let's take a different patient with a condition, we'll call it smoldering myeloma, which is an asymptomatic precancer, where you are by definition asymptomatic and feeling fine. And
they discovered it somehow.
Yeah, they discovered it by
you went to the hospital to get some tests, and they said, "Oh, by the way."
Exactly. Or an asymptomatic prostate cancer or any of those things. This was found by accident. We call them incidental.
Yeah.
Meaning,
I like the prostate cancer one.
you didn't know it until some doctor told you had it.
Right.
And now you're freaking worried about it because some doctor ran some tests that they shouldn't have ran. And now I'm faced with them prescribing a drug. The level of evidence that I will require in that scenario better be freaking great.
Right.
It better be a drug that makes them feel better, which is impossible
because they're feeling fine.
They already feel good.
Right.
So if there's not going to be anything that makes them feel better, because there's nothing on earth that I could give that human being to make them feel better, it better be shown to make them live longer.
Right.
And unfortunately, there are drugs that are approved in those spaces
that don't make you live longer.
have not been shown to make you live longer.
Yeah, they just change the size of the
change
spot on an MRI.
What we call a surrogate endpoint, whether it's a PSA level, whether it's a protein in your blood, whether it's the size of a tumor on the scan. These are all surrogates for what matters: overall survival and feeling better. So again, and this is where medicine, it is an art. You have to know your given circumstances, know what the stakes are, and you have to take all these things into account when you're making your decisions. And, it's not black and white. And again, I don't have the same threshold for every given scenario in front of me.
Of course.
Okay.
I fully understand that. Makes common sense to me. So given these problems, how can we change the system? How can we fix the system?
I think one is first making it okay to speak up about these things. The more in our field,
very important.
Yeah, where
very
you
important.
don't, I've given reasons why maybe you wouldn't want to speak up about these. Less publications, less invited to premier meetings, being considered an outsider in the field, and those are true things. But I think the more people that speak up about it, we'll see that most people I think most people agree if they actually listen to what we have to say and be like, those make sense. Our system's great, but we could do better. We should incorporate some of these things. And, whether it's through social media, Twitter, whether it's through organizing our own conferences, I love giving talks to patients. I go to patient advocacy groups, these very ones that I say are funded by Pharma, and I'm invited to give a talk about some drug. But guess what? They get this kind of talk. And I'm hoping they do. And usually the organizer's like, why did you do that? I go, I do what I want, and those types of things. The trainees, when I have trainees with me, they want to learn the latest and greatest, but I just start with some common sense oncology and go through some of these basics, discussing endpoints, what they mean, what matters inherently to patients. And I've discovered just through these forums, I have met numerous people. I get direct messages through my Twitter account all the time from people who are scared to speak up, but completely agree completely. And so, I am hopeful that we're going to make a change, and there is in the works with some of my mentors of potentially starting an organization that we have professional organizations, but an organization whose mission is more in line with what I've been speaking about. And again, not to replace our current system, just to have a voice.
Change some of the rules.
Some of the rules have a voice.
Right. What the control group should be. What the control group should be on, for example. That's
or not allow,
Sounds like a very simple thing to change.
You would think, and that's where...
No, it would be if it was legislative.
And that's the other thing. And my knowledge, as most doctors are, legislation, law, I can only know so much. And, you're right.
No, but it means changing a rule at the FDA, but they're unlikely to do it without intense pressure because they want to stroke the back of the pharmaceutical companies because that's where they're going to go next when they retire.
The FDA needs tighter regulation,
right.
Which is a shame. I would hope that, like in the old days, I could say this drug's FDA approved, it's going to help my patients. But I've given you numerous examples where they do not. And, we're not going to talk much about COVID, but I think the example's worth discussing. Let's take Paxlovid, okay? And, we may have different opinions on this, and I'm happy to talk. Yeah, Paxlovid is the drug that's approved for symptomatic COVID, and it was shown in a study to decrease the risk of developing severe COVID and help a percent of patients live longer, not die. Very small percent. But it was shown in a group of patients that were old, sick, and all completely unvaccinated. And our government right now, you could be a 25-year-old, have had a few vaccines. One could even argue if you needed all those vaccines to begin with, be basically asymptomatic, not anything close to being what would have been in the study, and get your prescription of Paxlovid, funded by our government that's subsidizing Pfizer. Pfizer's got $1 gazillion from this drug. Make them run the stupid study. Make them run the study. It wouldn't take long to get the endpoint of severe COVID. You get that pretty fast. There's no shortage of COVID these days, but we've given them a complete pass.
So it didn't go phase 1, phase 2,
no,
phase 3?
they did a phase 3, but they did a phase 3 in a population that is not applicable to today. Today, everyone's had COVID or has had 10,000 vaccines, and it's not, they ran it in a completely different scenario. And, this drug's not benign. It has side effects, and we're just giving money to Pfizer. And the magnitude of benefit, even in that population, wasn't ginormous. It wasn't huge. So, they should
even
run
the one that was published.
Yes, the one that was published. It was beneficial, but it was in a sick group of individuals who were high risk. They were all unvaccinated, so our highest risk group. And it showed a modest decreased risk of severe COVID and death. Yeah, but I would say in who's getting it in the United States and who's paid for it, the 25-year-old who's had COVID 3 times and had no symptoms, he don't need Paxlovid. Okay, but here we are, and again, whether it's boosters for 3-year-olds, these are things that are approved without really good data, but here we are approving these things, and it needs to change.
And it's probably getting approved because officials in government want to show they're doing something. We've approved these drugs. We've rushed them through on an emergency basis. And they approve these drugs because the pharmaceutical companies probably donate to their campaigns. Because huge amount of money. The government pays for all the COVID shots, and for Paxlovid is free. You don't even have to show your insurance card.
Government pays, and I can't speculate for the reasons, but what I can say is the people in charge of this policy are bad at their job.
Yeah.
Whatever is making them make those decisions,
right.
I don't know. But in my opinion, they're not doing a great job. Okay,
that's right. That's as far as you can go.
In that. So, and the FDA is not doing a great job either. They just approved that Alzheimer's drug that causes brain bleeds. Tell
us about that.
Well, there was a drug in Alzheimer's that again showed a surrogate endpoint. It decreased some sort of signal on a brain scan. They charged $1 gazillion for it, and in post-marketing, it's causing lots of horrible side effects, bleeding, and it hasn't really been shown to ever make anyone better. And there's a huge market, right? Alzheimer's, there's no good treatment for it. So, it's things like that they continue to show us that they're not changing.
And once, has approval ever been revoked by the FDA?
I gave 2 examples. So just recently, 2 drugs in multiple myeloma were approved. There's quite a few examples.
Okay, so they do get revoked.
But some
when there are too many negative effects,
or
why? Why do they get revoked? Well, not because they weren't effective. It's because they killed somebody or something.
Well, they'll get revoked where, as I said, there's this process called accelerated approval. So the typical process involves a large randomized phase 3.
See.
But certain drugs can get designated accelerated approval where the FDA will say, we will approve it contingent on that you run this randomized study.
I see.
Although they don't always make them they don't force them to do it that fast, and sometimes it's years later. But the 2 recent examples in multiple myeloma, both were shown to harm people in the randomized study after showing to improve these surrogate endpoints in the single-arm phase 2 studies, and they were both revoked from the market.
Okay, so it's fair to say that they don't hide negative data from the government. Is that correct?
They don't hide. Well,
they show positive data that is biased because they're comparing it to something that isn't great.
The way that they write things in publications, like every study has what we call a primary endpoint, and that's what the study is designed to answer. But they will also have what are called secondary endpoints, where they're suggestive, but it wasn't what the study was designed to answer statistically. So if the secondary endpoints look good, they're always going to tell you about them. But all those secondary endpoints that look crappy, you never hear about them. So there's a selection bias in the type of data we hear as physicians that's being presented at our conferences. The FDA, it's a little bit different. They get all this data disclosed to them, but they're still approving these drugs based off trials with bad control arms or bad endpoints. So again, without a policy change, I don't know how we're going to fix that.
We're not going to figure it out tonight, I think.
But talking about it with you, and hopefully a bunch of people listen to this podcast and people start thinking about it and speaking up, and you
need more allies. You need more people like Dr. Aaron Goodman.
That sounds a little narcissistic, but yes.
No, that's why you're on the show, because you're an outstanding physician, clinician, and you're honest and objective, and that's and brave. I would say brave. What you do is brave.
No, I appreciate it. And I think, honest in our field's hard. And I think the more I do, the more uncertainty I know is in my field. And, the decisions I make in oncology are literally life and death for the patients in front of me. And at the end of the day, all I can do is be honest with them and tell them what I know and don't know. And it ends up being patients are surprisingly very, it's okay to tell your patient, I don't know, as opposed to making up some BS, and, that's a whole nother talk about talking like, how do you tell your patients their prognosis, how they're going to, what I've learned is don't hide it from them every step of the way. Let them know. Every time I see a patient with cancer, I regroup with them and I go, here's where you are in your disease process. Here's what it means. Here's what I can or can't do. And when it gets to that point where can't help them, it's not a shocker and it's understood. And that's been an evolving thing for me in the care of patients with cancer. But it makes it easier and the patients are receptive and, it's still hard to tell them this news, but it's better than, which I maybe or may not have saw in training, of kind of avoiding those discussions until it's too late.
No, and I think it's also extremely important for the physicians, especially in cancer, to say, okay, here are the benefits. We can extend your life by, the data shows we can extend your life. I don't know if it's a month or 2 months, but here's what you're going to go through. And I have to say that after my chemotherapy treatment, as you may recall, it was recommended that I talk to a radiation oncologist to irradiate those areas, which happen to be my jaw and my esophagus.
Not fun places to get radiated.
So the suggestion was that has been shown to lower the incidence of recurrence. Now, I asked for the paper on that, and I did read the paper, and it was only 8 people, and not a big study, and it was equivocal. But what was important, what I want to point out, is the radiation oncologist, whose name I forget, was very careful and open to tell me what the side effects of radiation were going to be. And they were so significant that I decided that even if it did decrease the chance of cancer recurring, it wasn't going to be worth it, that I'd have all sorts of lesions in my esophagus and lose the sensations of taste, all sorts of negative repercussions about radiation to that area. Sure, if you're going to have radiation in your arm, your leg, but your brain, your head, your esophagus. So I decided not to, and it turned out that was the right decision. But I want to point out that that's yet another physician who's a good guy who told me straight out, here's what's going to happen. You're not going to be able to swallow. Oh, horrible. He was not a good salesman, I'll tell you that. So maybe, the companies that make the radiation equipment aren't paying off enough. Yeah. But so there are good physicians, and I'm happy to say the ones at the University of California in San Diego at the Moores Cancer Center are exceptional, and you stand out. So I want to thank you for coming tonight to be with me, Aaron, and thank you so much more for your courage, for speaking out, because you're speaking out on behalf of patients. That's what you're doing.
Well, thanks for having me. It was a great talk, and I look forward to more conversations in the future.
And thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob, please subscribe, and you'll automatically be notified of future podcasts in this series.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. If you enjoyed these interviews with some of today's most influential thought leaders, please follow and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can also watch each episode on YouTube as well. We'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate reading your comments on YouTube and social media, and now you can submit your questions on my website as well. Head over to lifelessonswithdrbob.com and click the question tab at the top of the page or the one on the right side of the screen, and let us know what's on your mind. I'll answer your questions at the beginning of each episode, so let it rip. Let's have some fun.